So we basically went over last class this idea of the consumer surplus, sorry. And the consumer surplus is essentially just a way of measuring the welfare that consumers have. And that it can be estimated as different things happen and prices change, or the quantity of goods they demand changes. And in general, it's a very good way of monetizing, or at least not monetizing, but placing into monetary terms the welfare of a specific group of society, in this case, the consumers in a city, in a region, whatnot. So the point here is that now we can look to the producer side of things. And the producer surplus is literally the equivalent of the consumer surplus, but in the case of the producers, of firms. And as you would expect, the producer surplus is just essentially the profits that those firms accumulate. With that in mind, um, basically, we can look into what those profits are. And you probably remember this graph, or this series of graphs, from before the midterm. So the idea here is that we have the marginal cost, we have the average cost, average variable cost, sorry, and the average total cost. And we know about the shutdown points and the minimum points in which you break even and stuff like that. But as you can see, the producer surplus is essentially, or can essentially be understood as the difference between your revenues and your costs. That was the profits. So this translates to the producer surplus being the area under the price, the market price, but above your marginal cost of production, or in other words, the area above the supply curve, which is below the marginal, below the price. So this translates essentially to this. These are the profits, the difference between the revenues and the costs that are positive. They are the profits and or the producer surplus. And this is for any particular firm. We are just taking a graph of any generic firm and plotting their the different cost structures. So essentially, this is just the producer surplus in a very similar way to what we saw last class. And so obviously, if this is the case, well, we want to see how the different things like change the profits of a firm. Suppose something like what is happening right now, that certain products like, I don't know, things that you can buy in the supermarket or that are being really demanded by people, like masks and stuff like that. So think of the firms like 3M, 3M, that essentially are selling all of these medical equipment and different things that are used for the pandemic. Probably their demand has skyrocketed. Therefore, they have increased the prices, or they can increase the prices of many of these goods. So any increase in price because of a shift in the demand can essentially create a surplus in terms of the producer surplus, or a positive change in terms of the producer surplus. Referencing the previous graph we had seen 2 slides ago, this is this new rectangle-like area in which you see the change in the producer surplus. As the price increased from P prime to P, well, there basically is a bigger area that is under the price and above the marginal cost, or above the supply curve. So this is literally just the producer surplus. This is a change in producer surplus, and you can see it this way. Any questions before I move on to the idea of how does this look for the industry and not only for an individual firm? As I was just mentioning, we just saw this idea of the producer surplus in terms of an individual firm. But now, when we were discussing last class how to evaluate and calculate the triangles of the consumer surplus, we were thinking of the aggregated consumer group. So obviously, you can do the consumer surplus analysis for an individual consumer, but the same analysis applies, and the same graph basically looks more or less for the consumer, one consumer, or the entire group of consumers of a region or of a city or something like that. as we saw from how you add up horizontally the demand curves. But in this case, to understand a little bit how this happens, if you see this, this is not just a regular, oh, let's get the area of a triangle type thing, because as Patricio mentioned last class, you would need integrals to calculate the individual producer surplus of just one firm. So what we do is we do a similar process in which for the entire industry, what we do is we add the different supply curves of the different firms. But the point is that it's just the sum of the different players that put out their products and their goods and sell them in the different stores and compete against each other. But in the end, the entire industry, the entire car industry, the entire manufacturing industry, the entire, I don't know, like, it's just the sum of all the people that sell this. So we can do the same type of analysis, the same type of idea that we did for the consumer side of things 2 classes ago. So imagine this, and I'll go quicker, yeah, I'll quicker than last time because you already know more or less how this applies. But now, instead of adding the demand curve, the individual demand curves, we're going to add the individual supply curves. So the same analysis applies. We're going to add these two firms' supply curves by price segments. There are prices at which individual firms can't produce because they're not covering their costs, and others firms, more efficient firms in that market, may be able to produce at that price. So this is the same idea. So as you see in the slide, let's suppose we only have a market in which we have two firms. This is much more realistic than the idea of having a market with only two consumers. We've seen a lot of cases in real life in which you have a duopoly. For many years, Mexican TV was this, basically like Televisa and TV Azteca in terms of the public television. So this is much more similar than what you could see in the consumer side of things. So if we have two supplies for two different firms, what happens if we start to basically try to add them up? And we do the same analysis in which we basically gauge at different prices what would be the number of units placed in the market. So the idea is this. If you start from price 0 upwards, basically you see the different places at which at this price, this store, or this firm is willing to produce at least 1 unit of the good in being analyzed. So let's think of, for example, a shopping mall in which you have a food court and you have a bunch of different food restaurants, or like basically fast food restaurants, I mean, that are competing against each other. We could group them all into the fast food industry, let's call it like this, of this particular mall, all of this particular side of the city. So at the beginning, if the price people are willing to pay for fast food is very close to 0, there can probably be no firm that can cover their cost of production for even a dish or a specific plate. So you would have no production at very low levels of the price. But the moment you reach certain threshold, and that threshold obviously changes from industry to industry, from firm to firm, based on their costs, they start producing. So the moment you basically reach the break-even point of the different firms, you can anticipate they will start producing. So there comes a point in which only the most efficient one of these fast food restaurants will be able to open at this price. So let's think of that price as P prime that we're seeing in the graph. So at P prime, or anything around this, we can see that firm 1 is sufficiently efficient that at a price even below P prime, they would be willing to produce. So as you see in the industry supply in the bottom of the slide, basically for the first price segment, only the most efficient firm participates, and the industry supply looks exactly the same as the individual firm 1 supply. And this is translated to this idea of, at the lowest price segment, the total units being sold in the industry, in this entire market, are the units being produced by the most efficient firm. And that makes total sense. Basically, pretty self-explanatory. Only the most efficient firms can produce at the lowest prices. That means that they have really low costs. So that is basically this first segment that we're seeing right now in the slide. So the moment you reach a higher price, which was this idea of the price segment between P1 prime or P prime and P double prime, now not only firm 1 can supply their units, but also firm 2 decides to participate because now they're breaking even, or now at least they're earning some profits, so they are willing to produce at this level of prices, at this price segment, which obviously translates to an addition of these units. So basically, the industry supply curve is a mixture of the red and blue curve, which is a mixture of the different slopes of the two individual supply curves. And this happens because in real life, if there were only two firms at this new price segment between P prime and P double prime that we're seeing right now in the slide, all the units in the industry being sold to consumers would be the sum of the units of firm 1 and the units of firm 2. So this is literally what's happening as the graph shows at the bottom of the screen. And if we continue, if there were more firms in this market, you would continue to basically doing all of these price segments. You could be more arbitrary in terms of the price segment you choose. But think if maybe you're dividing, I don't know, you're a product that's being sold at a supermarket, you could maybe analyze this in terms of like for every peso segment, like from 13 to 14, from 14 to 15 pesos, stuff like that. And you would see basically all the firms that are willing to participate and sell their products at those prices. But this is basically how you get up the industry supply curve. In the same way that we did the industry demand curve, not the industry, the aggregated demand curve, we can find the industry supply curve through the horizontal sum of the individual supply curves. And essentially this translates to the following. If this was the original producer surplus of one firm, once we add this up, we get something, for simplicity, obviously, because the curves would be different and you need to calculate it with more differential calculus or integral calculus, I mean. You get something more like this, in which you can have more or less a linear supply curve, which is the sum of all the many different individual supply curves, and therefore you can easily calculate this producer surplus in the same way you calculate the consumer surplus, which is just the area of a triangle. In this case, the top part of the blue triangle would be the price of the market, the equilibrium price, and the rest of the triangle would be composed of the area below the price, but above the marginal cost, which is the supply curve.